Lord Mayor of Hamburg, Patron Ole von Beus, and moderator Peter Etter, as well as all of you in attendance today. It's my privilege to come in from the United States and have a chance to greet you during this most important summit on business and the economy. I can think of no more important time in my lifetime than today to address these extremely important issues of where does our economy go forward, not just for Germany or the United States, but for our entire globe, because indeed we have become a truly global economy where actions in one country impact actions throughout the world and impact the economies throughout the world. The title of my talk today is 7 Lessons for Leading in Crisis. And I've written a new book, which each of you will receive a copy of by the same title, 7 Lessons for Leading in Crisis. And I'm going to give some background to start out about the crisis and how I see it today. And I think there are many, many analyses of going on of how we got into the crisis. So I don't plan to go into that, but I do want to focus on the issues that I think are important in all kinds of crises, from organizational upheavals to business takeovers to severe product problems, quality problems, personal crises, as well as economic crisis when we're affected by the great forces around us. I've thought about this a great deal over the years, and I think the current crisis over the past year has really brought these issues to the fore for me. And so when I was returning from Davos last January 2009, I sat down and wrote a paper on what I thought was really required for leading in a crisis, and then decided to turn it into a practical set of lessons for leaders at all levels. The reason I did so is I truly believe, both having led business organizations for over 30 years in general management capacities and leading Medtronic as chairman and CEO for 10 years, and more recently, the last 7 years, teaching leadership in Switzerland at the Federal Polytechnic and the business school IMD, then at Yale and now at Harvard, that I think we can discern some, if you will, eternal lessons of how one deals with a crisis. I continue to be very distraught over how many leaders fail in a crisis and actually destroy great institutions, because they don't follow simple, basic lessons of taking responsibility for their leadership. The great Peter Drucker once said, leadership is not about money, titles, power. Leadership is responsibility. And I think that's true for each of you in the audience today. It's certainly been true in my life. And I think the media often writes it up in terms of power struggles. It's really not about that. It's taking responsibility. I was literally appalled at the former head of Bear Stearns, Alan Schwartz, and the former head of Lehman Brothers, Richard Fuld, who told the New York Times last spring that they had been wrestling with what responsibility they had for the crisis, and if they had a chance to do it all over again, both before their companies failed and went bankrupt, each of them said individually, I wouldn't change a thing. Now think about that. I wouldn't change a thing about taking a 135-year-old firm into bankruptcy. I think each of us who's faced far less crises would certainly take responsibility for our actions and change a lot of things. I know I'd like to have a lot of situations back and do them over, because I think in retrospect I could do them a lot better. So the idea that somehow nothing would change, I think is totally misleading and shows a denial of reality. Crisis is also the very best way to test a leader. I would go so far as to say in your organizations that one should not assume a major position of leadership unless they have been tested in a crisis. And the only way to gain the experience of how to deal with a crisis is actually go through them. So I think for younger emerging leaders under 40, this is the very best opportunity. Many of my students are in their late 20s, early 30s, are experiencing the first crisis in business in their lifetime. Sure, we've had minor recessions. This is not a minor recession. But I think that they are learning a great deal from this. And I think before people reach positions of heads of organizations or even major sections of organizations, they should be tested in a crisis. There's an old English proverb that says, you know, a smooth sea never made a skilled mariner. I think there's a lot of truth in that. One cannot become a skilled leader just by managing through smooth seas. Nor I love to grow businesses, but I can tell you it's a lot easier growing a business than it is leading an organization through a crisis. And that's the real test. And I've seen leaders literally destroy great organizations because they've never faced that test of leading through a great crisis. Now, before I go into these 7 lessons, let me give a brief update from the United States of how I see things. I do serve on the Board of Goldman Sachs, and I think you all are well aware of what's going on in the United States relative to the financial markets. I'm of the view, quite confident now, we have weathered the storm. And it did take $4 to $5 trillion from the United States Treasury and the Federal Reserve Bank to stabilize our financial markets. And I do not see major, if you will, bankruptcies or losses of major institutions going forward, or the kind of necessary bailouts we've seen all the way from Citigroup to General Motors. Certainly there will be organizations that fail and go bankrupt. But I think in terms of those that destabilize markets in the way that Lehman Brothers did last fall, I don't anticipate that going forward. But this crisis is far from over. What was a crisis on Wall Street, in the United States at least, has definitely shifted to Main Street. We continue to lose jobs at a very rapid rate. By the end of 2009, between 9 and 10 million jobs will have been lost in the United States. That's 3 times the level of the number of jobs lost in any economic downturn in the last 60 years, which is the lifetime of most of us, certainly in this room. That's a very severe problem. Our reported unemployment rates are now in double digits in the United States, but I can tell you the real number is 16% and going to 20% if one counts those people who've gone from well-paying jobs as engineers to working part-time in a fast food operation, or if one counts the people who've given up for looking for jobs. We have a very, very large number. I was in Spain recently, and I know the number there is already reported over 20%. So this is a very severe problem. I think it's even made more severe by the fact that these jobs don't seem to be coming back anytime soon. I think the economists, frankly, and many of you are economists, have looked too much at so-called leading indicators, like the trend of the stock markets, the trend of financial markets, credit spreads, and other technical measures, liquidity and other things in the economy. I think one needs to look at the fact that I think we've seen fundamental changes in how people look at jobs. And I think these will play out in great disruption over the years ahead. Certainly the global workforce, the global workplace, is replacing the local workplace. This may not be as true in service industries, but surely it is true in manufacturing industries and even in software development, where many companies with large numbers of software development have moved those to countries like India. So these represent fundamental changes. In the United States, I don't know any CEOs who are hiring today other than a percentage of their replacement hires. I don't know anyone that's adding workers. As you know, the United States went through a period of loss of savings where people were not saving, and I think they're trying to rebuild those savings now, where they actually went considerably into debt and people are finding themselves having to come out of debt. So I don't see a great turnaround on the jobs front until and unless there is a revitalization of new company formation, entrepreneurship, innovation, and creativity, which is driven by underlying technology and creative people. I see that as the great hope for the developed world. And even so, I see many of the, if more routinized manufacturing jobs, software coding, and things like this going to developing countries. So I think we're seeing fundamental shifts. And so this brings to the fore the importance of education, but education that not just educates people in the basics, but also encourages entrepreneurship and new company formation. And I think governments such as Germany and the other governments of Europe and the United States need to encourage this. Because in the United States, at least, we don't see a great addition to the traditional large companies. They will not be hiring employees in their home country. So I think we need to look at how these things are changing. And that brings me into thinking about these 7 lessons for leading in crisis, because surely this economic crisis is not the last crisis we'll face, and there will be many crises coming up. So let me start with putting up this slide that shows the 7 lessons, and I won't go over each of them as a group, but I will go over them individually. So let me start with lesson number 1, which is face reality, starting with yourself. No one can solve any crisis until one faces the reality that we're in a crisis, and also acknowledges that I, as a leader, had some role in getting us into this situation. A good example is the American pharmaceutical company Merck, which had a drug Vioxx, which it pushed very aggressively on a general population release. Now, Vioxx was a very good drug, and it helped people enormously with pain, but it also led to secondary effects that were negative for people with cardiovascular disease. And Merck did not address this quickly because it went into a form of organizational denial. And it took an additional 3 years to do a randomized trial to prove that people with cardiovascular disease actually had a problem, even though there have been indications for some time. Then Merck acted very responsibly, pulled the drug off the worldwide market. The problem is they lost the entire drug. The entire $3-4 billion in revenues on an annualized basis went away, and people who needed the drug and who could tolerate it lost the drug. Contrast that with Amgen. Amgen is the American, actually global leader in biologics. Amgen had a drug called Aranesp, treating of anemia. It was used extensively off-label. It was also marketed by Johnson & Johnson, and both companies did ongoing studies that started to indicate problems, particularly in the off-level use and high dosages that were used for anemia. And I have written a case at Harvard on Kevin Scher, the CEO of Amgen, and how he dealt with that problem. Because it said at first all his people were saying the regulators were the problem, and there was a person at the FDA that they thought really was causing them the problem. And Kevin finally said to his top executive team, let's pull back and say, how would this look to us if we were a regulator? Wouldn't we be concerned about this? And that turned around the thinking of the Amgen executives to recognize, yes, we have a problem, and we'd better address that problem and deal with it. So Scher then assigned his top executives in charge of research and development, manufacturing, and marketing and sales to come up with a plan to address the problem. Weeks went by, and no plan produced. The people were literally frozen in place. Finally, Scher said he took an entire hour, sat by himself, and he said, what's my role in this crisis? I am the chief executive officer. How did I create? What did I do to contribute to this? Did I push too hard for growth? Did I not have us examine these things closely enough when we were going through the marketing process as well as the approval process? And he said, I wrote down all the things that I had to do with this, and I came up with a long list. And I went back and shared that with my top executives. And they were shocked that a CEO would admit his mistakes. But what it did, as he said, is it freed them up to acknowledge their role in it and to put together a plan to correct it. They then moved forward to pull back Aranesp, to change the labeling, to eliminate the off-label use. It cost them $1 billion in sales, but it saved the drug. I think a very good example of facing reality, starting with yourself. The second lesson is don't be Atlas. Get the world off your shoulders. Atlas, you recall, was the creature who carried the world on his entire shoulders, a mythical creature. And I used to feel that way at Medtronic all the time. Like, millions of people could be harmed if this defibrillator doesn't work. And maybe a lot of people would lose their jobs. And how would our shareholders be affected, particularly employee shareholders who had their life savings tied up in Medtronic stock? So I felt that burden. And I felt it particularly when we had quality issues. And Medtronic had some significant quality problems in the 1970s and 1980s before I joined the company and became chief executive officer at the start of the 1990s. And we faced a number of those problems. And I think I could only face them because although I have an engineering degree, I was not the technical expert in these products, by turning to my team and getting the very best advice I could. I remember a particular problem that the engineers were very concerned about, and the medical head of the company said, this is not a medical clinical problem, so it's okay. I remember in other cases where people were saying, this is really not a problem, and as we studied the data, it indeed was a problem, and we had to recall defibrillator leads, pacemakers from time to time, and really face these very hard issues of what do you do when you're in that never land and you don't know if it's a real problem or not. I found I could only deal with that by gathering my team around me and turning to them for help and support. During these times of crisis, it's also extremely important to have an external team you turn to. I've had several mentors, my spouse as well, a men's group that I turn to for support during these times, because one needs to have the resilience to get through it. One needs to have the personal habits in place that help you get through it. We don't talk as much about this. I think we really need to be talking about how do you cope with high levels of stress. What are you doing to keep your mind sharp, your body in shape, and to relieve the stress that we all face? Because under stress, I found at Medtronic, I simply couldn't make good decisions. Sometimes I had to go climb in the mountains or take a jog or have a long discussion with my spouse about what I was facing. And I found that having those external resources gave me that sense of resilience. And it also allowed me in turn to be vulnerable, as Kevin shared with his people, and admitting mistakes. And I think leaders who don't admit their mistakes are in for deep trouble. So let me go to the third lesson now, which is dig deep for the root cause. I think too often we look at superficial causes of problems and don't get down to what is the real cause of this problem. And until we can find what the root cause of the problem is, we're setting ourselves up for very difficult times. We found in those Medtronic cases, often what appeared to be the problem was not the problem at all. It was a much more serious problem than that. But by making a design change to correct the first problem, we may have created 2 or 3 more. I also had experience early in my career in the aerospace business at Honeywell, where we found a lot of overruns, and we didn't recognize that the problem was that one of our people had suspended the estimating system, and that's what led to a lot of denial about what was happening in cost. So I often find that getting into the root cause is very problematic. You know, Anne Mulcahy, the CEO of Xerox, who was facing bankruptcy when she took over Xerox in 2000, said that, you know, these problems really have long roots. And until you study the long roots of the problem, you can't get to the root cause of the problem. And certainly she found in Xerox that the soft underbelly of Xerox had never been really addressed. And she had to go through the painful process of laying off a number of people, facing up to the fact that plain paper copiers might change dramatically in a digital era. And she's now geared the company for the paperless office. Here's the plain paper copy company talking about the paperless office. So here's a leader who faced that reality, dug deep to get into the root cause, found out what it really was, why people were in denial about the problems the company was having, and was able to address it and restore the company to full health and life. You can contrast that with Kodak of the United States, which never really faced the fact that its basic photography business with film was going out and being replaced by digital, and as a consequence is struggling yet today. So let me turn now to lesson number 4. That's get ready for the long haul. You know, we like to think of crises like a squall at sea, back to the mariner example, as something will pass and we can just batten down the hatches, go underboard, in a few hours this storm will pass. But what if it doesn't pass? What if it continues on for months, for years? What are we going to do then? You know, we need to be ready for the long haul of these crises and recognize that this could go on for a long time. I mentioned earlier I serve on the Board of Goldman Sachs. And Goldman Sachs had 2 events that occurred in 2007, which were, I would call, shots across the bow. The first was in March. And I remember sitting in a boardroom when people came in with long faces and said, you know, we've lost a lot of money, $70 million, less than $100 million on this subprime mortgage crisis. Now, this is very early in the crisis. And they realized when they started studying it that this crisis could go on for a long time and was going to be much, much deeper. So they made the decision to get out of the business. And they stopped doing business with companies like Countrywide Financial, which are very marginal in terms of the subprime crisis and actually aiding and abetting it. And, you know, it's very interesting in making that decision, they got out about 18 months before others did. So it wasn't like they weren't in the trouble business. They just faced the reality of it and got out early And they took a loss, but certainly far, far less than many other organizations did from the subprime mortgage crisis. Then about 6 months later, they had a problem with 3 of their quantitative funds. And they realized the turbulence and volatility in markets was telling them that their models really were not good in predicting what was happening with derivatives. And they really got very worried about that. And they decided at that point in time, where they've been focusing very intensely on return on equity, to focus on building up cash. And so by the start, when the real crisis, not the start, but the real crisis hit in September, around September 14th of 2008, Goldman Sachs had built up a very substantial cash balance, well over $100 billion. Today, that number is around $160 billion. And that enabled Goldman to weather the storm, whereas a number of its major competitors simply didn't have the cash to do so, and they folded, or they were taken over by the United States Treasury or the Federal Reserve Bank. And Goldman was able to get through that because they had faced up to the fact that they were going to be in this for the long haul, and they needed to have the cash reserves to do it. And I think had they not done that and followed the route of a number of other institutions, they might have had the same level of difficulties. So it's not that you can avoid the problems. I think we all face problems. Again, if we're sailing at sea, we're all going to face stormy seas. It's a question of how one deals with that, and are you prepared to deal with it for the long haul? Lesson number 5 comes from a statement by Machiavelli, which he said, never waste the opportunities of a good crisis. Again, back to my Davos experience, Benjamin Netanyahu talked about the problems that Israel had had when he became Minister of Finance back in around 2002, 2003, and Israel was going through a crisis similar to what many other countries have been going through in the last year, great loss of jobs. And he saw an opportunity to literally transform not just his government, but transform the economy of Israel to get prepared to dealing with this. And I think that's a good message for all of us, that when we're in growth times, it's very hard to get an organization to cut back. When things are going well, we inevitably build in waste, layers of bureaucracy. We add too many managers, too many middle management people, too many staff people, too much support. A crisis like this gives us an opportunity to do things we otherwise couldn't get done. Frankly, to close marginal factories, to move production to more productive locations, to consolidate our forces, to reduce the number of overhead people and staff people we have, to get really geared up on a worldwide basis. Companies that do that are going to reap the benefits for 10 to 20 years. Look what Jack Welch did when he came into General Electric as CEO in 1981. He actually precipitated a crisis because he saw the great global competition, which ironically many of his global competitors did not see, like Mitsubishi of Japan, Philips of the Netherlands, Siemens of Germany, did not anticipate that. And Welch literally, and he got a very bad reputation called Neutron Jack for taking out so many layers of cost. But as a result, he transformed GE from a company that was well run but not highly competitive into a company that was highly competitive and highly performance oriented. And that ran right up for the next 20 years because he had put the company in a position of being extremely competitive. And we see that now in Siemens is taking advantage of the problems it had with payments overseas. And under new leadership, Gerhard Kramer, the well-known chairman of Siemens, Peter Loscher, who came in from Merck, actually, he is German, transforming Siemens now into a much more competitive company because they're taking advantage of this crisis. Had they done so earlier, they might not have faced some of those difficulties. But now having faced them and realizing the huge disruptive effect that that's had on the company and how to settle these various agreements, which they've handled extremely well and gotten settled, are now in a position to prosper going forward and have become much more competitive. So I think in a crisis, one can make one's organization much more effective, and much better at coping with the crisis. So let me turn now to lesson number 6. Lesson number 6 is you're in the spotlight, follow your true north. It used to be a lot of companies operated very privately. Certainly that was true of European companies. Certainly true of a lot of American companies. They thought they could operate in a private way and say one thing through their public relations department and think another thing internally. Today's world has changed all of that. The velocity of information on the internet means that whatever happens in one part of the world is known instantly throughout the world. That if you're not transparent, others are going to unmask you and they're going to find out. That internal and external communications have really morphed into one. You can't say one thing to your employees and another thing to the outside world. But beyond that, a crisis like this says you're really in the spotlight. People are watching you. You're in a goldfish bowl. And if you look at Lloyd Blankfein, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, he's in that goldfish bowl every day. People are criticizing every action. They're observing everything you do. The criticism is always fair, but I can tell you what happens inside goes outside. After I joined the board of Goldman, Hank Paulson was going through the crisis coming out of the dot-com collapse of 2002, 2003. And in early 2003, he went to a conference hosted by Bear Stearns. And he said at that conference, under pressure from the security analysts, to make further reductions in his staff. He said rather casually, at a firm like Goldman, I'm convinced that 20% of the people produce 80% of the value. Well, this literally set off a firestorm within the company. And people were very upset because they said, we thought we were part of a team, that every one of us produced value, and maybe you produce it today and I produce it tomorrow, but we all add value to this company. Aren't we important to Goldman Sachs? And so Hank, seeing that what he had said externally came back to resound against him internally, immediately sat down that evening and put out, he felt he wanted to go see everyone individually, but he knew he couldn't in a global firm. So he put out a voicemail and followed by a video to every employee in the organization and basically apologized for what he said that was not what he really meant. What he truly meant was he had reacted too much to the security analysts, and he did acknowledge the value of each person. That didn't totally mollify everyone, but it certainly was an example of addressing the problem immediately. This goldfish bowl effect is very great because attorneys, regulators, media have as much information as people do inside the company. And oftentimes employees, frankly, look more to those external sources for credibility, particularly if leadership is not totally open with them. And so I've become a very strong advocate of transparency. The only reason not to be transparent is we have something to hide. And I'll tell you, there are plenty of people, whether it's the bloggers out there or other sources of information that goes to the media or goes to external observers, have lots of reason to unmask us if they sense we're dissembling with them and not telling the whole truth. I think in today's world, one needs to put the whole truth out there and say, here's how we're dealing with it. Certainly we see a contrast in the current management of Siemens compared to the previous management in dealing with these kinds of problems. So the question is, how does one create a culture of candor in an organization? I think that's each of our jobs. It starts with us because we've got to follow what I call our true north. Because when you're in that spotlight, that's the real test, when everyone's watching you. And you can have had 30 good years, and in 30 minutes you can blow it by not being honest with people and not dealing well with this. And this is a real test. Are we true to what we say we believe, to our values, our principles that we've operated with throughout our life? But a crisis, when we have to admit our mistakes, as Kevin Scher did, is the real test. And so as I talked about in my book, True North, this is the real test of, are we going to stay true to what we believe in? Are we going to follow our values, our beliefs, and our principles? Because many people have failed in crisis. And I've worked a great deal with emerging leaders as well as new CEOs to say, this is the time to step up. Of course, there's times when you don't have all the answers. You may have to say, we've got the best people inside this organization, the best people outside working the problem. There are no magic answers here. You're going to have to give us weeks or months, but we will get to the problem. But I don't think one could deny the problem. If you do, you're only heading for far greater trouble. So I think it's very important to recognize you're in the spotlight, and this is your opportunity to prove that you will follow your true north and you will stay on course of what you believe. Lesson number 7 is focus on winning. Go on offense now. I found throughout the many crises I've faced in my lifetime is that when you go through this, things change in very fundamental ways. And many people are inclined to think, I just can't wait until things come back to the way they were in 2007. Well, you know, the reality is they're not going to come back to that. Fundamental industries have changed. Consumer buying patterns have changed. If you're General Motors and you think that somehow people's car buying patterns are going to revert back to that period, it's not going to happen, and you're just going to prolong your own agony in not facing up to the realities. But on the other hand, if you can transform your company as a result of this crisis, you can transform whole industries and see, how is that industry changing? How could I take advantage of the fundamental underlying change in consumer purchasing patterns or in what's happening in my industry? Then you can come out the winner from these massive organization changes. You know, one of the more interesting companies in the United States is Apple Computer. Apple had been on a downward slide for about 15 years, ever since Steve Jobs got fired, or even going back before that, forced out by his board of directors. The founder was forced out, and he'd gone off to do animated films at Pixar and the organization Next with its Unix-based computers. And so when Jobs came back in, that computer slide was still going on. IBM clones and other personal computers dominated the market. And he tried to reform the Macintosh into the iMac, had some great success with the product, never really took hold. You know, and then he transformed the company with the introduction of the iPod, which is really transforming it, going into the recording industry, later into iTunes, going into the whole music and other forms of podcasting, and totally has transformed these two fields. And more recently, with the iPhone, he has transformed telephony. When some great companies have been at this game for decades and have done extremely well, the iPhone brought tremendous animation, now some 300,000 applications on it. So one has a world information at one's fingertips. You don't even need a GPS in your car. You can look at it on your iPhone. So this has changed dramatically fundamental industries, and interestingly enough, the computer business at Apple has recovered too. I think it's just a classic example of a leader that saw the opportunity not to be on the defensive, but to go on offense and focus on how could Apple win the game. Another leader more recently is doing that is Ingenuity at PepsiCo. PepsiCo is very much a global company, and they are certainly focused on not being defensive about some of the issues, societal issues they're facing, but to go on the offense. When she took over in 2006, she pledged that by 2010, the company, which had been dominated with sugar-based drinks and high-calorie snack foods, would have by the year 2010 50% of its U.S.-based revenues from healthy foods and healthy drinks. And she made a big commitment to campaign against obesity in the United States. She went further with that and committed to save 5 billion liters of water in its own operations, recognizing the water crisis was coming, and really got on top of some very, very important issues. One could have been defensive about those and try to defend against regulators, defend against changes, defend against consumer patterns. But instead, she got out in front of those and has the company much better positioned to deal with these issues as they go forward. So I'd like to encourage each of us to think about our own companies now and our own organizations. How can we transform those to go on offense and transform our industry in very, very positive ways? I certainly tried to do this at Medtronic and broadening the base of Medtronic beyond the pacemaker business, which was obviously slowing down, into a full range of implantable medical technologies, something we did to get in the spine business, the diabetes business, the epilepsy business, the cerebral palsy business. But you know, those are just businesses. But the whole idea that we can take on a lot more, and we can get in front of really important issues taking place both in our society, in our economies, and in our own companies, and in ourselves. How can we transform ourselves? How can we literally reinvent ourselves as leaders to use this crisis to be a different kind of leader that will be very effective in the years going forward? Because a lot kind of leadership we've seen in the past has proven to be ineffective. And I think one has to hold leaders accountable for getting us into this crisis. But it's going to be real leaders that get us out of the crisis. Authentic leaders who follow their true north and know where they're going. And I'd like to ask each of you to think about what are those defining moments in your own professional lives that have really made a difference? And how has this crisis become a defining moment for you and for your company? And how can you use it as an opportunity to transform not just your company, but to transform your own leadership, to literally reinvent your leadership, and to turn the forces of your company at addressing the world's great problems? Robert F. Kennedy, during his lifetime, said in Johannesburg in 1966, "Few will have the greatness to bend history itself." Maybe some in this room will, but he went on to say, but each of us can take on problems with our own sphere to make a difference in the world. And the sum total of all those actions will write the history of this generation. Think about how each of us can transform our companies, our organizations, and ourselves today to use this defining moment in our history, our personal history, the history of our organizations, the history of our countries, to say, let's pull together to make a difference in our own environment, to address some of the world's great problems, each in our own small way. And the sum total of all those actions will write the history of our generation. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you. I really wish I could be there in person, but I hope you have a great summit. Thank you.